welcome everyone to our monthly meeting, and we are particularly glad and honored to have a very special speaker today, Archpriest Emeritus Professor Andrew Louth, extremely distinguished scholar, author of many books, and above all, the editor of the new edition of the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, which every individual, as well as quite apart from every library, should have. It's the most marvelous resource for everyone. Father Andrew is going to talk about a discourse by Bishop Simeon to a monk Polycarp of the Caves Monastery at Kyivan. A very appropriate topic, and the content of the discourse is extremely interesting. So over to you, Father Andrew.
Well, first of all, I'm not an expert in this area, but when I was asked by Thea to think of something, a text, a short text, that we could discuss at this meeting, this was back, I think, perhaps in March, when Ukraine was very much on one's mind and very much still is. I think I probably hoped then that by the time we got around to having this session, things would be less fraught, but that's, I'm afraid, not the case. And so, also, the Caves Monastery is in my mind as well, because I thought I'd heard on the news that the Caves Monastery was being shelled by the Russian troops, which would be multiply unacceptable, because the Caves Monastery does actually belong to the Moscow Patriarchate, and I think still does. But in fact, the news turned out to be rather, not exactly fake news, but just misunderstanding. I think what I was hearing was about the shelling and actual destruction of the Svyatogorsk Monastery in Donetsk. Also faithful to the Moscow Patriarch, and also therefore evidence of the complete indiscriminate destruction that Putin is wreaking in the Ukraine. And so my mind turned to this interesting document called the Pateric of the Kyiv Caves Monastery, and I thought this would be appropriate. And I looked through it and thought this chapter for Discourse 14, would be the sort of thing we could talk about. But it also turns out that today, the 2nd of September on the old calendar, is observed in the Russian and is observed in the Russian and Ukrainian Orthodox calendar as the feast of the founders of the Kyivan Caves Monastery, St. Anthony and St. Feodosi. They're both observed separately with separate dates, but in the Russian and, well, the Slav calendar, effectively, they have a feast of them together. So there is, as it were, an added relevance that I had not envisaged until this morning in having this today. Now, I think it would be useful to give some sort of background. I hope it will, because otherwise it'll be a very short talk. Some sort of background to place this Pateric in its context. Well, it's in Kyiv, and the traditional or the symbolic date of the beginning of the conversion of the northern Slav countries is the conversion of Grand Prince Volodymyr of Kyiv in 988. What actually happened then is not at all clear. And it's not clear that he was there. It was there that he was baptized, or indeed this is a particularly good date. But we don't need to go into the controversy about that, which is mostly political. But it's symbolic, because though certainly Volodymyr was not the first notable among the Rus to embrace Christianity, his godmother, his grandmother rather, Olga, had already been a Christian, and there were doubtless others among the nobility who had embraced Christianity by this date. Volodymyr's conversion led to, or meant, the forcible conversion of the people of Kyiv and the beginning of a church in the realm of the Rus. I should perhaps say that there are two words that can be used, and they need to be both be. We can either talk about Russia, or we can talk about the Rus. The Rus really is a people, Norwegian in origin, governing the Slavs, and at this time the center of their presence in the lands of what we call Russia was in Kyiv. Only later on did Christianity spread through the northern areas. So the beginnings are certainly in Kyiv, and it is a symbolic date. It's symbolic too in another way, that it is in fact, the significance is perhaps more political than religious. The real story of the conversion of the Rus, like the real story of the conversion of most nations, didn't take place at the political level primarily. It took place at the level of ordinary Christians, establishing themselves in different places of the world. Often, in fact, I think, led by merchants who are all over the place. And Christian merchants established little pockets of Christianity. And the later great names of the missionary movement are usually people who came along later when there was something to go to. And there's little doubt that monks were involved in the early years of Kievan Christianity, but this is a story of people who remain anonymous, about whom we know very little. The first monastery to be established in Kyiv was in the course of the 11th century, the century after the conversion of Volodymyr. And the one that is most famous was established in this period. And this is the so-called Caves Monastery of Kyiv, established in caves quite close to the city of quite close to the city of Kyiv. And there are two people involved that we need to introduce, the two people whose feast it is today. First of all, Antony, who was born about 983 in Chernigov, who, as a young man, had sought to live the monastic life and ended up on Athos, which had only very recently been founded, or only very recently been recognized, as it were, as a center for monasticism by the establishment of, first of all, the great Lavra, and the dates that we give are dates that are concerned with the giving of a charter by the Byzantine emperor. The story of monasticism on Athos is a good deal older. And he joined the monastery of Esfigmenu, which still survives, and at some point was told by his spiritual father, as a result of a vision to his spiritual father, that he should leave Athos and go back to the realm of the Rus and establish monasticism there. And he went back and established some sort of monastic presence in Kyiv in 1051. Antony's inclinations were very much hesychast. He was much more interested in a quiet life of prayer. He wanted to be a hermit, and indeed, later on in the history of the Caves Monastery, he became a hermit dependent on the monastery and ceased to be the abbot. He was succeeded by Theodosius, or Feodosi, who had been born in Vasiliev near Kyiv in 1932. In 1932, at the age of 23, he went to Kyiv and joined the Caves Monastery. As I said, eventually he took over, well, fairly soon he took over from Antony. And this led to a very dramatic change, which is reflected in our text. A dramatic change from a monastery that was primarily concerned with promoting the spiritual life in individuals who lived as hermits in a lavra, to the introduction of properly communal monasticism, cenobitic monasticism. Though the monastery has to this day kept the name Lavre, though as that has happened, the term Lavre has begun to be used, or has been used for centuries now, in a very different way from its original meaning of a community of hermits. The Caves Monastery was by no means the only monastery in the early period around Rus. It's estimated by scholars that there may have been 70 monasteries established in Rus before the Mongol invasion of 1238 to 40. But the Caves Monastery is the only one that can trace its history back to before the Mongol invasion. Not only has the monastery survived as an institution, but its Pateric also survives, which is a history of the monastery, which contains rather a history of the monastery from the time of Antony and Theodosie, though everything in it was written a good deal later. The title Pateric is obviously derived from the Greek Paterikon, and it is a claim to belong to the genre of monastic writing that goes back to the 4th, 5th century, writings such as the sayings of the Desert Fathers, but also writings like the Lausiac History or the History of the Monks in Egypt, and all sorts of, and various other monastic literature that grew up over the centuries, including things like the Spiritual Meadow of John Moschus. But it doesn't really fit as a literary genre to any of the examples of the earlier period. I mean, it's not a collection of sayings, for instance, like the basic bit of the Greek Paterikon. It is not the account of a visit to the monks of the area. It is, in fact, a history of one particular monastery, the Caves Monastery, or rather, it contains material that bears on that. It's not exactly a history, but it contains sources that are in some way historical. The Pateric is 13th century in origin, so it belongs to the period just before the Mongol invasion. But it exists in a whole variety of redactions, and the form that you got a translation of, a historic translation, and a very important translation by Muriel Hebel, that was only published very late on in her life, which is a very great work, and her commentary and her notes are enormously valuable for gathering together what little we know about monasticism, Russian monasticism in this period. The redaction that's been translated belongs to 1462, so therefore to the 15th century, 2 centuries or so after the original redaction, and it's what's called the Second Cassian redaction. But I'm not here going to go into the different redactions because it's not really relevant. The Kyivan Pateric is really a collection of discourses, or slova, which is the equivalent of the Greek logi. Not all of the same kind, but all gathered together in 38 discourses. And very quickly, I'll just tell you so to give us a sense of context, what they contain. The first 6 chapters are by Simon, who was a former monk, and by the time writing was the Bishop of Vladimir and Suzdal, and he was writing in the 13th century. And this is an account of the foundation of the monastery, which is, properly speaking, called the Monastery of the Mother of God in Kyiv. And it tells the story fairly briefly and tells stories about, rather, fairly briefly, the 2 founders, Antony and Theodosie. Then there is another account of Antony and Theodosie's founding of the Caves Monastery in the 7th Discourse. Then there are 4 chapters about Theodosie himself, the first of which is a life by Nestor. Then there's a chapter about 3 contemporaries of Theodosie, anonymous. And there's an account of Niphon's visit. Niphon, who was Bishop of Novgorod in 1156, by Niphon himself. Then there is our text, which we'll look at in more detail in a minute, the letter of Bishop Simon to Polycarp. The next 9 chapters, 9 discourses, are further discourses by Simon. The next 12 chapters are by Polycarp. Then there's an anonymous account of Isaac, the cave dweller. 37 is a tract against the Latins, and 38 is a brief anonymous account of the election of Vasily as abbot. Now, some of these are anonymous, but there are 3 writers, three writers who are named. One is Nestor, who gives the life of Theodosie and some other bits and pieces. Then there are 16 discourses by Simon and 12 discourses by Polycarp. The Simon and Polycarp, more or less, actually most of this, at any rate in its original form, goes back to the period before the Mongol invasion. Right. Now, Discourse 14 is a bit different from the other discourses in the Pateric. It is a letter from Simon to Polycarp, and it is a very severe and disapproving letter to Polycarp. Most of what we know about the context of the letter has to be drawn from the letter itself, because we don't know much else. It seems that Polycarp had at some point left the cave monastery in order to become an abbot somewhere else. First time, it seems, in a monastery of St. Cosmas and St. Damian, about which we know very little, and then had sought to return, to the great joy of the monastery itself. But he was an ambitious man, and Simon quotes something that Polycarp says that confirms this from Polycarp's own lips. Later on, he sought to become abbot of the monastery of Demetrius, that never came off. And this letter is in the particular context of his seeking to become a bishop. It begins very abruptly, and I'll quote that to start off with. Brother, sit down in silence, collect your thoughts, and say to yourself, you wretched monk, did you not leave the world and parents according to the flesh for the Lord's sake? If even here, when you have come to seek your salvation, you neglect spiritual things, why have you invested in the monastic name? Your black garments will not save you from torment. And most of the letter is largely in this vein. It is a rebuke, a sharp expressed rebuke to Polycarp, and is particularly concerned with his ambition and his neglect of the monastic life itself. But a little bit further down that page, there is something very interesting. As I said, originally the monastery had been a collection of hermits living together with Antony, but fairly soon it became a Cenobitic monastery. And Simon clearly supports very, very strongly this Semitic ideal, very strongly. He says, for instance, that a little bit further down that first page, page 113, for whatever you do in your cell, it is of no value. Whether you read the Psalter or sing 12 psalms, this cannot be compared to a single Lord have mercy said in the congregation. This is a very, very sharp condemnation personal piety in favor of the monastic ideal of singing and praying together. And I think that it'd be fair to say that for the most part, this contrast is not usually expressed quite as sharply as that. And then he goes on first of all, he goes on to give examples of the way in which communal prayer is effective. He talks about Peter, the head of the apostles, the story in Acts, who was seized by Herod and thrown into prison, and did not the prayers of the church save him out of Herod's hands? And then he quotes from David, "One thing I've desired of the Lord, and this I will earnestly seek, that I should dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, and should behold the fair beauty of the Lord and visit his holy church." And the Lord himself said, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, and where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them." And he comments, "And when there is such a large company gathered together, more than 100 brethren, so much the more have faith that our Lord is present." Another person from the Russian tradition who emphasizes this very strongly is Saint Maria of Paris, who in her discussion of the nature of the monastic life lays enormous stress on the fact that the monastic life is essentially a communal life, and the job of the Christian is to support other people and to assist them in their need. She's not at all keen on the kind of hesychast way of life, and indeed was a great trial to Metropolitan Evlogi, who rather hoped that she might establish something more on the traditional lines of a women's monastery. Another thing he then turns to, and it's is the question of bearing insults. Clearly, Polycarp didn't like being insulted and responded rather sharply. And he goes on to give various examples from the scriptures which say that we shouldn't, in fact, we should bear insults and that we shouldn't grieve about it, nor be quickly moved to anger, but fall down and prostrate ourselves to the ground before that brother and say, "Forgive me, brother. Put right," and he summarizes, "put right the transgression in yourself, and you will overcome all the power of the enemy." And again, he gives a biblical example, this time from David, when he is insulted by Semei or Shimei in 2 Samuel 16, 5-12, or 2 Kingdoms 16, 5-12. And one of his servants, who could not endure to see his king being insulted, said, shall I go and cut off his head? Why should a dead dog curse my lord the king?" To which David replied, "O son of Samuel, let him curse David, so that the Lord may look upon my affliction and return me good for his cursing." And then Simon moves immediately to the example of Christ. "Consider, my son," this is on page 115, "how our Lord humbled himself and became obedient to his Father unto death. When reviled, he threatened not. When he was told, 'Thou hast a devil,' and when he was beaten and struck on the face and spat upon, he was not angry, but prayed for those who crucified him. And so he taught us, pray for your enemies, do good to them that hate you, bless them that curse you." As for what you did in your negligence, enough of that. "For that reason it is fitting that you weep, since you abandoned the sacred," this is now talking directly to Polycarp, "the sacred noble cave monastery of holy Anthony and Theodosi and the holy monastic fathers who were with him, and went to be superior of the monastery of holy Cosmas and Damian, the silverless ones." And he says, "You acted well in going back." And then he goes on to talk about the fame of the monastery. I mean, he starts off by saying that, yes, trying to be a bishop, to be a bishop is a good thing, and it says so in the scriptures. But the same scriptures also say what kind of a person should be a bishop. And until you think that you measure up to that, you should refrain from it. Nevertheless, the fame of the Caves Monastery in Simon's terms can be measured to some extent by the way in which it has provided so many people to the so many bishops rather to the church. There's mostly polemic on 16 and 17, but 118 he starts to give a list. Brother, many bishops have been appointed from the Caves Monastery, dedicated to the most holy Mother of God, just as the apostles were sent throughout the whole world by Christ our God himself. And they illuminated the whole land of Rus through holy baptism, like bright lights. First Leonti, Bishop of Rostov, a great prelate whom God glorified with incorruption. He was the first to occupy that see and suffered many torments at the hands of unbelievers. He was the third citizen of the land of Rus, together with the two Varangians, to be crowned by Christ, for whose sake he suffered. And you yourself have read in the life of Holy Anthony about Metropolitan Hilarion, who was tonsured by him and later considered worthy of priesthood. And after that, there was Nikolai and Ephraim of Pereyaslav, Isaiah of Rostov, German in Novgorod, Stefan in Volodymyr, Nifon in Novgorod, Marin in Yuryov, Mina in Polak, Nikolai in Tmutarakan, Fyoktis in Chernihiv, Lavrenti in Turov, Buka in Bilhorod, and Ephraim in Suzdal. If you want to know them all, read the old Rostov Chronicle. There are more than 30 together, and then with those who came later, up to myself, sinner that I am, nearly 50, I think. So he's not against people being ambitious, so long as the ambition is well, so long as one can fulfill what is required of one. And it quickly, I think, moves to the letter very quickly ends. And turns back to the situation of Polycarp himself. I ask you in truth, my brother Polycarp, where you have heard of more wonderful miracles than those that occurred in the Holy Caves Monastery, who is more blessed than these fathers who shine forth like rays of the sun to the ends of the world? In this present narrative, I shall give you a true account of them, in addition to what I have already told you. And now, brother, I shall tell you why I have such fervent faith in the Holy Antony and Theodosi. And that actually introduces the next discourse, Discourse 15. But we finished with 14. And there's plenty of time for questions. I hope there are some.
I think that's okay now. Thank you very much for that, Andrew. That was marvelous. Fascinating text. One thing that occurred to me is, does Paul Polycarp have a chance to answer back to in the later discourses by him? And does he ever address Bishop Simeon?
I don't think he does. I mean, it's a long time since I read all of them, but I think he doesn't. And I actually, in the introduction by Muriel Hebel, she says that we have no idea how Polycarp would have responded to this. He doesn't seem to become a bishop. It looks as if he stayed in the monastery.
Does he come across as ambitious in his discourses?
Polycarp doesn't come across in his discourses. He is he just tells you what he wants to tell you. He doesn't talk about himself. And Simon doesn't always talk about himself, but in this case, he gives as good a picture of himself as he does of the person that he's talking to, I think. Let's go back to the.
We have a chance for questions, comments, so please either do it through chat or put a hand up, and I'll try and locate people. Well, what struck me was the fact that just about the time that the Kyiv monastery was being founded, you have Georgian monks going back to Georgia and probably doing the same. And Tamara can probably comment more on that, but the synchronicity of that is quite intriguing, because Athos at that stage was not particularly famous, was it? As a monastic center?
I honestly don't know. I mean, but of course the trouble is that this has been redacted in the 15th century.
Yes.
And there are certainly remarks that suggest in the Pateric, as we have it, that suggest that that it was a great center. It was Antony naturally went there in the beginning of the 11th century. That may represent that may not represent. It may not have been that natural then, I don't know. But in the 15th century, it might have been the fame of Athos would have been greater, I think. Though beginning to decline by the middle of the 15th century.
Anyone with questions, comments, please?
Yes, this question of synchronicity, it is exactly contemporary with the time of Euthemius at Kyivan.
Yes.
And his work of hagiography. What
also struck me was the fact that the compilers of the Pateric actually included this discourse, because it's so very personal.
I know.
And maybe, I suppose, if it's a century or two later, perhaps it doesn't matter so much. But if it's within even a couple of generations, the people, descendants, relations might be a bit upset.
I confess I can't work out very clearly from Muriel Hebel's account. She gives the impression, well, she says the Pateric is a 13th century work drawing on both contemporary and ancient sources. 13th century is very, I mean, it's before the Mongol invasion, but it's I suppose it's talking, most of what it's talking about is 11th century, the period of Antony and Theodosius.
Yes.
There's two centuries. I don't know. I mean, like so much that I only as an amateur looked at in this sort of where any Slav monastics, the evidence is very, very scanty, and remains so.
Yes. But even so, I don't recall coming across anything quite so personal.
No.
And that is very striking.
Yeah, but it's also that it's personal, but it's also that Polycarp himself is the second most important named writer in the Pateric. I mean, it's not just somebody that he's slanging off. I mean, it's somebody who is actually important in their tradition.
Yes. Yes, and to have him put in place, as it were, in the actual Pateric, does seem very surprising.
Yeah. I mean, the more we talk, the more I'm beginning to think, wonder rather, in what sense in what sense the Pateric is a 13th century work. A lot of the material in it is 13th century, in fact, most of it is 13th century. But whether it was put together as a Pateric at that date, I don't know.
Yes.
And there's nothing very much in the rest of her introduction which makes it at all clear what the different recensions amount to. Actually, all the redactions are 15th century.
And none of these different traditions leave this out of delicacy.
Yeah, she says the oldest copy of the narratives of Simon and Polycarp, which form the core of the Pateric, is an Arsenian manuscript written in 1406.
Oh, yes.
The Professor Arsenia, Bishop of Tver. And in this text, oh, interestingly, in this text, she says are omitted, not included. In this text, Simon's letter to Polycarp and Polycarp's letter to Archimandrite Akindine and his account of Olympe, the icon painter, are omitted. Well, it's probably not a question of being not omitted, they weren't included.
Yes. That's intriguing. Anyone with questions, comments, please take advantage.
The first obvious thing it tells us is that when the Slavs start to write about their monastic tradition, they want to put it in the context, in a literary way at any rate, put it in the context of its Greek origins. I mean, well, I suppose not just Greek, but I don't know, how do you put it? It's the things that it recalls by calling it the Pateric well, they're not writing just in the Greek tradition, but the Greek tradition is the version in which they knew it. But the whole, actually, sorry, you make me, I'm sorry, it's a good question because it makes me think, and I haven't thought about this kind. I mean, I'm not quite sure how one would describe, Sebastian will on this for me. How one would describe this body of fantastic material that belongs to from the 5th century through to the 8th century or so. I mean, I don't think you could properly describe it as Greek because a lot of the Latin tradition is already underway by then. And what about the Syriac tradition? What about the Paradise of the Fathers, which is one of the largest collections of this material that I know of is in Syriac, isn't it?
The two influential Syriac fathers who got translated into Greek were Ephraim and Isaac. Ephraim in Greek, in fact, is not genuine Ephraim, except on occasional cases. And most of it seems to be actually composed in Greek in some monastic center, quarter. So that's really rules out Ephraim as himself as an important influence, whereas Isaac certainly is a genuine Isaac, but it's only, well, it's the largest part of his writings that get into Greek in the round about 800, and then dispersed eventually into Church Slavonic, Romanian, Latin, and ultimately various vernaculars. So the Syriac element, I suppose, is largely Isaac in the tradition, monastic tradition that's inherited by the rest of the world.
Yeah, is that by the time of the, even by the time of Antony and Theodosius, the canon law that would have governed the church would have made it mean that bishops had to be unmarried. and the most normal sort of way of being unmarried is to be a monk. There were exceptions in Byzantium, but they came from scholars like Photius, who presumably remained unmarried because he had a household that he didn't need that. But it seems to me that it's very, very clear that Simon regards as part of the function of the monastery and evidence of its fruitfulness, the fact that it provides all these bishops for that southern bit of the Slav lands, even by the end of the 13th century.
Any more questions, comments?
In a kind of way, it's a flip side to another. I mean, one of the problems of the diaspora has constantly been that where do you get your bishops from? Because monasticism hasn't flourished in the 20th century quite in the way that's necessary. I mean, who's going to be the next Archbishop of Finland, for instance? There are very few possibilities, and but it's. I mean, all the bishops of all those who've thought about it have regarded this as a very serious problem, because canon law as it is at the moment, you either have widowers, or you have people who just don't want to get married, or you have monks, and only the monks sort of seem to fit that category most easily.
Yes, this was a real problem in the Syrian Orthodox Church in the 1960s, because very few monks, and I gathered that the Patriarch was going to gather a synod to discuss the problem and suggest making widowed priests bishops. But just at that point, as on Mount Athos and in Egypt, monasticism had a slight revival and provided the next generation of bishops. So sometimes things change at the last moment. And to go back to the very direct criticism of Polycarp, and the contrast between saying the office in your cell and saying it in the community. And it seems in many ways to go against what you find in many other sources. But then, of course, it's such an individual case. And I remember being quite struck with a passage in Isaac somewhere in the Kephalia, where he says, points out that different statements refer to totally different situations in the biblical text. And so you have lots of contradictions. And I suppose this is just a similar case.
I mean, there is an interesting parallel to Simon's rebuke of Polycarp in something that I've read in a footnote in Lasche somewhere in one of his attacks on Zizulas. Zizulas has said just this, just the same. What you do in your cell, Jesus' prayer, it doesn't count. Only thing that matters is what you do in church.
Yes, that's interesting. Yes,
and that goes quite strongly against the way monasticism lived in the Orthodox world for a very long time. The two things are together.
Yes.
I heard Archbishop Nikita say very recently that monks are there to pray, and they pray most of the time. Well, the office doesn't take most of the time, so in their cells they're still praying, and that matters and is important.
Yes. Any more questions, comments? Do speak up. Are Simeon's other discourses personal in this sort of way, or are they directed to a more general audience? And who are the addressees?
They are just stories that he tells about various things. Like,
yes.
I mean, for instance, the first 6 discourses are really a history of the monastery.
Yes.
And various events connected with it. You know, I think that in fact this is really is quite exceptional, and that mostly the discourses are the sort of things you'd expect to find. I mean, they are associated. They're about the people who stories about the people, sometimes accounts of the people who were important in the early history of the Caves Monastery.
Which makes it all the more surprising that this particular one was included.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, the reason at some level, but it may not be how important, I don't know. That what he has to say, that there are 2 things that he thinks make it very difficult to become a proper bishop. One is ambition and the desire to exercise power. And the second one is not being able to bear being spoken against.
Yes.
Think what a difference it would make if bishops thought that the real qualification of being a bishop is to even to be able to bear insult without sort of reacting, and not to be ambitious, but simply seeking to serve. And you've got this attack on his ambition and attack on his being unable to bear insults. And then you've got Simon saying, what a wonderful thing a good bishop can be, like me. And he actually does say it like that as well. And he talks about, he does talk about, who does not know me, the sinful Bishop Simon, Lord of the Cathedral Church, the ornament of Vladimir, and the other church in Suzdal, which I founded myself, how many towns and villages they possess, and so on. I mean, I think of it like that. It does look like kind of very lively exemplar.
Our time is almost up. Any further questions? My internet sounds feels as if it's going to give up. So keeps on telling me that it's very weak. But any quick questions? We've got a few more minutes. So maybe before I disappear due to the internet failing, stop and thank Father Andrew very much for most interesting and unusual text, completely new to me, and very intriguing attack on ambition. And very timely too.
Indeed, yes.